Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for the ones calling from Europe. You've dialed into the Small Island Developing States Partnership webinar for the scientific community, organized by DESA together with the International Science Council. And we will have different speakers today talking about sustainable development in small island developing states, the overview of the Samoa pathway and challenges facing small island developing states. We also will discuss where the scientific community can make the most difference in partnering for small island developing states, and have some concrete examples on how science can contribute to this agenda. So that everybody knows, we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website after it's finished. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Ambassador Louis Young, Permanent Representative of Belize to the United Nations and Chair of the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, Co-Chair of the SIDS Steering Committee, to make some opening remarks.
And a very good morning, and thank you all for joining us in this webinar today. My name is Lois Young, and I'm from the Permanent Mission of Belize to the United Nations, and I believe this is an excellent and efficient platform for increasing global outreach to different stakeholders to encourage partnerships for small island developing states. And I'm very pleased to be engaging with the scientific community today. The Alliance of Small Island Developing States, AOSIS, is the advocacy group that speaks at the United Nations for Small Island and Low-Lying Coastal Developing States, the SIDS. Throughout AOSIS's 30 years of international advocacy, we have stood firmly behind science as the basis for development of global policy on climate change, the ocean and biodiversity, and sustainable development. At the same time, we have looked to increase scientific understanding and technological advancements to innovate SIDS's specific solutions to the unique developmental challenges that we face, and to expand opportunities to attain our sustainable development objectives. We can look no further than the efforts underway in SIDS to transition to 100% renewable energy with smart grids, new technologies for water purification and recycling, and to explore nature-based solutions for adaptation to climate change as examples of science at work in SIDS. AOSIS thus strongly supports a more proactive role for scientists and researchers in multilateral diplomacy, especially at the United Nations. Already we have seen how uniting behind the science has been a game changer for policy making, especially in climate change. Recent reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, particularly the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, have brought worldwide attention to the urgency of climate action at all levels. Similarly, in the recent discussions on a new ocean treaty for the high seas, many stakeholders, including governments and civil society, referenced the biodiversity report to step up efforts to conclude that treaty by 2020. And while the availability of scientific reports is not new, the convergence of the science agenda and the global policy agenda signals a new approach to multilateral decision-making. The challenge we face is to determine how we can harness science for more informed decision-making without compromising the integrity of the scientific process. It has served AOSIS well in its advocacy to be able to draw on independent scientific bodies such as the IPCC and other independent research and analysis. It is important moving forward that we are able to continue relying on independent scientific research and analysis that can respond to the issues that policymakers are grappling with. AOSIS is keen to strengthen relationships and forge new partnerships with academia and the scientific community to address the less politically favorable, but no less globally significant issues, one of which I should say is loss and damage issue. The Samoa Pathway, which is a sustainable development blueprint for SIDS, recognizes the importance of science in a number of different contexts. First, it reaffirms the importance of engaging with the scientific community when taking actions on climate change, and that's in paragraph 40. It recognizes that an ecosystem-based approach should be utilized on ocean-related activities based on the best available science, paragraph 57. It supports action to undertake marine scientific research and develop capacity of SIDS for maritime delimitation, paragraph 58F. It encourages integration of scientists from SIDS to international research teams in addressing the causes of ocean acidification, paragraph 58N. And most importantly, it recognizes that science, technology, and innovation are essential enablers and drivers for sustainable development, paragraph 110. Although these specific areas have been identified in this international development agenda, the Samoa Pathway, we do acknowledge that the scope of engagement and the role of the scientific community is much broader, and it's also evolving with time. As we will undertake the midterm review of the Samoa Pathway on the 27th of September this year at the United Nations, this is an ideal time to see how this evolution can be addressed and how the scientific community can further assist advancement of this development agenda as we move ahead over the next 5 years. In similar vein, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development also encourages the role of the scientific community in achieving the SDGs and mandates the convening of the Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Science, Technology, and Innovation for SDGs every year. This forum, designed to discuss cooperation around thematic areas for the implementation of the SDGs, congregates all relevant stakeholders to actively contribute in their area of expertise. This feeds into the high-level political forum taking place each year when the SDGs are reviewed. Colleagues, these are important opportunities to explore new areas for collaboration and expand existing avenues for cooperation with SIDS. In addition to this, I wish to emphasize the importance of researchers and scientists from SIDS countries being engaged in these processes to ensure inclusive representation. This is currently severely lacking. Science, research, and innovation has the potential to support policymakers in an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world. I look forward to your contributions during this webinar, particularly on how the science agenda can best support the SIDS agenda at the United Nations. And I assure you that as chair of AOSIS, I am ready to facilitate the deepening of our collaboration so as to advance progressive global solutions to what may seem to be intractable challenges. And thank you all, and let's proceed with the webinar.
Many thanks, Ambassador Young, for your opening remarks. We are very happy to hear about the Samoa pathway and the recognition of science in the Samoa pathway, as well as the importance of researchers and scientists from SIDS countries themselves to also help with this important agenda. Next on the agenda will be Mario Vieros, Director, Coastal Policy and Humanities Research from the University of British Columbia, to talk more about the gap analysis of where more partnerships are needed for small island developing states.
And good morning, everybody from Vancouver. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Could I have the PowerPoint, please?
Yes. One moment. We're gonna be there. Let's see if we can change the slides here. I'm sorry, apologies, we just figured out it doesn't seem to respond to our changing slides at the moment. So we're gonna load again the PowerPoint. But Mario, if you would like to start.
Yeah, certainly. I can start talking, and we can go from there. So my purpose here today was to talk a little bit about the in-depth review or analysis of SIDS partnerships that was undertaken in 2018. And this was an opportunity to really try to understand the landscape of those SIDS partnerships, and at the same time help countries prepare for the midterm review of the Samoa pathway. So in undertaking the analysis, the questions that we asked were, what is the status and trends of SIDS partnerships? How have these partnerships addressed the Samoa pathway priority areas? And then from there, are there any underrepresented areas? We also tried to look whether the partnership had any impact or some impact on their beneficiaries and on sustainable development of SIDS, and that proved to be quite a difficult question. We also looked at what challenges the partnerships had faced and the lessons learned for the next generation of partnerships that hopefully will be starting. So we looked at probably over 600 or so partnerships with SIDS, and a lot of these, about 550 or so, are in the database online. And I see. Okay, not quite yet, PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. Excellent. So the first slide, yeah, there we go. We've also got a lot of material from global partnership dialogues that were run from 2015 onwards, as well as the regional and interregional dialogues in 2018. as well as interviews, regional reports, and other materials. So there's really a lot of information that fed into this final report that is now online and was published in July 2019. Next slide, please. So getting into the content then, and just looking briefly at the numbers. We looked at the partnerships divided by SIDS region. So we looked at global partnerships with partnerships that applied to more than one SIDS region. And these were often partnerships that were led by UN organizations. We also looked at the regions specifically, the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Caribbean, and Pacific. And out of these, the Pacific had the most partnerships, followed by the Caribbean. And what we can see in all of these regions is that there was an increase in partnerships from the 2014 SIDS conference when these were first launched to today. And there were quite a lot of new partnerships launched in that time. But at the same time, there's also a lot of them that were completed. And this provides a good learning opportunity for the lessons of these partnerships that the next generation of partnerships can then apply. I should say that the numbers are really not the be-all and end-all. There's a lot of partnerships that we may not know about on a global level that operate locally. So this is possibly an underestimate of the partnerships that are ongoing. The main lead organizations in the regions are governments and regional organizations and globally UN organizations. NGOs and civil society participated in partnerships, so did the scientific community and private sector, but in much smaller numbers than the other entities. Next slide, please. So how did these partnerships then address Samoa Pathway priority areas? And in looking at them, all of the priority areas were addressed, but unevenly. And in fact, in most regions, there were a lot of partnerships that addressed oceans and seas, possibly spurred on by the SDG 14 related UN Ocean Conference and the voluntary commitments there. And climate change was also well addressed. There were also many partnerships on sustainable economic growth, sustainable renewable energy, and disaster risk reduction. So these were really upcoming areas. And all of these areas are of extreme importance to SIDS. Many of these partnerships had tangible on-the-ground impacts that furthered the implementation of the Samoa Pathway. And these impacts were things like direct impacts on beneficiaries. For example, where a community would have better access to water and sanitation, or direct impacts on the environment, for example, where a protected area was put in place or a certain area was sustainably managed. There was also partnerships that furthered the knowledge, information, data, and indicators that were available. And in that, there were quite a few science partnerships. Improved coordination between agencies and organizations often happened as a result of these partnerships. And at the same time, they also improved the capacity of participants as well as beneficiaries. And often also resulted in a positive policy environment. For example, partnerships that enhance the participation of youth in policy making. Next slide, please. But there are also some underrepresented areas, quite a few, and I don't like to say gap areas because there was always something in each one of these, but they were not as comprehensively covered as some of the other aspects. And these included aspects of social and economic development, in particular addressing inequality. And these were things like income inequality, marginalized groups, youth employment. And also multiple dimensions of poverty, which is a very complex issue to address and a difficult one, and may require sustained investments in human capital, such as education and health and food and nutrition security. Sustainable transportation also was somewhat underrepresented. There were a few partnerships on this, but this is something that's extremely important for remote island communities, particularly having low carbon, low cost options for communities for transport of people and goods. water, wastewater, and sanitation, again, there were projects, partnerships on this, but many of those have now ended, and there's certainly more need to develop this area. Health and NCDs, particularly assisting countries with their NCD-related activities. There's only one global partnership specifically on NCDs. However, governments do address this directly through their policies. Gender considerations, things like income equality, women's participation in the workforce, and women's leadership were addressed to a certain degree, but again, not comprehensively. And while we saw a lot of partnerships relating to the ocean, what there were few partnerships in was the integrated ecosystem management that would focus on whole islands, from the connection of the terrestrial areas to the watershed and to the sea, and then linking this to human livelihoods as well. And finally, sourcing development finance for SIDS, innovative financing options. There seemed to be a great need for those. Next slide, please. So my last slide then, and having looked at all these partnerships, the question of how can science and scientists contribute, and as Ambassador Young said, scientific collaborations are extremely important in underpinning sustainable development, but also on their own in building the knowledge base that is available for SIDS. So I think this is something very important, and having SIDS scientists participate in the international collaborations, building capacity of SIDS scientists, and also institutions in SIDS countries where that is needed. Mutual learning between SIDS regions, between SIDS and other countries. And in doing so, I think science also has the possibility to further gender equality and foster innovation as well. Try to foster the young female scientists out there. Collaboration that's built around somewhat pathway priority areas would certainly reflect SIDS priorities as well. And looking at some of these partnerships, I mean, one thing I saw less of perhaps is the integrated or multidisciplinary approaches to research, where you have researchers from very different disciplines working together and exchanging ideas. And I just put a couple of ideas here. For example, climate change being a major issue in SIDS, and its impacts on oceans and fisheries also has very direct impacts on human health. And addressing these kinds of climate change connections would be really interesting. Also, many SIDS are in the process of building their blue or green economies. And while these will foster economic development, can they also address inequality, inclusion, and poverty, some of those areas that were less represented in the partnerships? There's also certainly a lot of opportunity for improving the available data for research, be it multidisciplinary research or otherwise. And I'm thinking that, for example, the UN Decade on Ocean Science provides a lot of opportunities in this direction. And finally, addressing new and emerging issues. Give me the next slide, please. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you with that.
Many thanks, Mario, for this intervention. Very interesting to see where there are more SIDS partnerships and which areas could perhaps benefit from more of partnerships. Also interesting to hear that it's important also with the multidisciplinary and integrated research to actually address these topics, because no topic could be addressed in silos. As our next speaker, we have Dr. Lucilla Spini, Senior Science and Policy Officer from the International Science Council.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I would also like to have my PowerPoint presentation. That's great. Thank you so much. Before I start giving you an overview on our activities, I would like to congratulate you all on the work on the partnership analysis, as well as the fantastic SIDS partnership toolbox, which I found also very useful in the past few months since it was launched at the HLPF. So I would like to follow on Mario's presentation and Ambassador Young points by highlighting a little bit on our activity at the International Science Council in order to enable new frameworks to explore new areas of collaboration and maybe identify current activities which are contributing to the Samoa pathway but are not registered yet as partnership, and also to develop new ideas for cooperation in view also of the events in September in order to further accelerate the implementation of the pathway. Next slide, please. So the International Science Council, who are we? We are a non-governmental organization which encompass both the social and the natural sciences community. The International Science Council was established out of a merger of the International Council of Scientific Union and the International Social Science Council in 2018. But actually, we build on over 100 years of international science organizations. Our vision is to advance science as a global public good, and our mission is to be the global voice for science. And our strength in order to achieve our vision and missions is really the membership. We have 135 member organizations, 40 members union and association, and 30 affiliated members. Amongst, for example, the unions, we have the International Union of Biological Sciences or the International Union focused on physics or chemistry and so on, but also on sociology. We have 3 regional offices that rotates around the world. At the moment, they're currently located in El Salvador, Malaysia, and South Africa. As you can see from the slides, we also have some members in SIDS country, not as many as we would like, but we're working on it. And later on, the president-elect of the International Science Council will give more details on this matter. Next slide, please. So allow me, first of all, to highlight the International Science Council within the UN landscape in terms of our roles, in terms of institutional roles, but also proactive roles in being of help to international processes. First of all, allow me to say that we are the co-organizer, together with the World Federation of Engineering Organization, WFEO, of the Scientific and Technological Community Major Group. As I like to describe in a very short way, we bring science and scientists to UN fora like the high-level political forum in order to make sure that we bring evidence, as Ambassador Young was saying before, into policy making through the major group system. We also develop ad hoc reports and brief. We've done a reports on SDG interactions, which many countries have found very useful also for the implementation of the SDGs. But also we try to support the work of the United Nations by replying to requests for review. For example, we have been one of the organizations reviewing the Global Sustainable Development Report this year, which is going to be launched in a few days, I gather. And at the moment also we're currently developing a coordination mechanism for science, for the Science Stakeholders Group for the UN Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. In addition, we also have different partnerships with UN bodies and agencies like UNESCO, WMO on specific issues like climate, ocean, and disaster risk reduction, for example. And last but not the least, we're also working towards endorsing proposals by scientists and scientific community for International Year on Science, like the current proposal for International Year of Basic Science for Development. And these are important endeavors in raising awareness of the scientific enterprise amongst the overall society. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a brief overview, given the time limit, on the different initiatives and projects that we have that might be relevant to the Samoa pathway and also to fill those unrepresented areas in the partnership forum. I'm going to start with 3 projects which are now in the 3rd year of implementation, so are the concluding phase and also legacy phase, if I may say so. One on climate change education, one on gender gap and in science, and one on light sources and crystallography. Allow me to highlight the one on climate change education as an important tool, which is highlighted all the possibility that we can use to integrate climate change across the curriculum in high school and undergraduate education. It's an online tool that teachers and education can use around the world in order to get lesson plans and teaching tools to adapt to the curriculum in all sorts of subjects, from biology to geography to humanities, social science, and so on. It's a tool co-developed by teachers and scientists in order to make sure that scientists can have the best scientific knowledge together with the best pedagogical tool. It's online, it's available to all the countries to use, all the teachers around the world, but also we've been conducting teachers training workshop, and it's unfortunate to say that we haven't conducted a workshop in any SIDS country, so I hope that maybe there could be some opportunity, maybe through OSIS, to develop opportunity to reach out teachers in SIDS country. As Mario mentioned, gender and the importance of narrowing gender gaps, also through science, we have an amazing project, the Gender Gap in Science, which is going to deliver data on the gender gaps in science around the world towards the end of this year. So we will keep each other posted in order to see how the gaps are going well or not well in different SIDS countries as well. And last but not the least, there is a project on advanced light sources and crystallography, which is very important also for building capacity in those countries who do not have access to latest technology, which are very important for the scientific enterprise. Next slide. Thank you. Now we have a series of international initiatives. I wish I could explain all of them in details, but just to give you a flavor of it, we have international initiative at the global level, which really makes scientists of different disciplines tackles important challenges like disaster risk, like urban health. We heard the issue of NCDs first in the presentation, so this is something that they're also looking at. Sustainability science, ocean, climate, space, data are among the different initiatives that we have. In particular, since we talked about the importance of building capacity of the scientific community also in SIDS country, I would like to highlight that many of them have capacity building opportunities. And for example, CoData, our committee on data for science and technology, they have summer school and training programs which enable scientists to get the latest information and knowledge on data science and also data policy. But also there are different fellowship schemes in ocean science, there are young scientist programs in earth system science. So we have a wealth of information that we really need to get to the SIDS country. And we, of course, disseminate this information through our membership, but we have to make sure that nobody's left behind. So we're really looking forward to work with the member states, and also thanks to DESA to reach out to those who are not familiar with our program so they can benefit from capacity building activities. And last but not the least, I would like to highlight that some of this some of these initiatives are in partnership with United Nations organizations like UNESCO, the World Meteorological Organization, for example, the International Oceanographic Commission, and so on. And one of the flagship initiatives that we have is called INGSA, the International Network for Government Science Advice, which actually has quite a lot of activities in the SIDS region. Next slide, please. And for that, I will stop here, and I hope that I gave you a flavor of all the different activities that we have, and that the dialogue will continue at the end of September, but beyond the end of September through implementation on the ground. And I'll give the floor to the President-elect of the International Science Council and Chair of INGSA, Professor Sir Peter Gluckman, who will provide a more in-depth overview of the INGSA activity in the SIDS region and recent developments at the International Science Council. Thank you.
Lucilla, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to speak and point out that they again emphasize that the ISC is really committed to working very closely with the UN and the international community on how science can advance the sustainability agenda in the broadest perspective. And in the particular area that I'm responsible for with INGSA, as chair of INGSA, which is the interface between science and the policy community, both at national and global levels. But before I do that, I might just also point out that I chair the Committee on Science Planning for the International Science Council. I'm pleased to advise that of the 8 members of that committee, one of them, Dr. Colin Tukitonga, is a representative of a small island state, namely Niue, one of the smallest states in the Pacific, so that we've been very keen to reach out and involve the SIDS community in our work, and I'll come back to that at the end. The international network itself is nearly 5,000 members in 100 countries, involving all those, involving scientists and policymakers that work at the interface between science and policy, evidence and diplomacy. It's very, very active. Next slide. It's very, very active. Our goal is simple, which is to provide a capacity building forum for policymakers, practitioners, and academics to build capacity and practical approaches to use scientific evidence in informing policy at all levels of government. The fact that it's grown in 5 years from 10 members to 5,000 members shows the interest and the enthusiasm in the work of the committee, of the network. It largely operates through conducting very focused workshops to build capacity by bringing policymakers and scientists together to learn how to work together on particular problems. It may be a generic workshop or it may be a rather thematic workshop. We do a lot of this in partnership with other organizations, particularly with UNESCO, the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, and always with a host agency in a region. And on top of that, we produce a number of reports, workshops, and expertise. For example, in the last year, we've advised a number of countries. One particular example would be Jamaica, on how to build a science advisory network. We've also produced reports on topics such as the meaning of well-being in the digital age, and INGSA is currently leading on a major project on understanding the drivers of social cohesion in this current context where social cohesion is being disrupted in many, many countries. And the other major project which INGSA and ISC lead together is a critical project for what we're discussing here and what the ambassador introduced, namely how to get the SDGs to have greater impact on the policy decision-making of countries. At the moment, there's a huge gulf between what the SDGs claim to be about and the practicality of how they influence domestic policy. And working based on the reports that ISC produced, INGSA, ISC, the European Commission, UNDP, the Stockholm Environmental Institute, and IASA are working together to produce a toolkit specifically for enhancing how policymakers might use this toolkit to make better choices about how to progress on the SDGs. That toolkit will be piloted in Ireland in the next few weeks, and Jamaica will be the second country in which this toolkit will be piloted, followed by a number of other countries lining up, wishing to be for this toolkit to be used there. It's a long story. I don't have time to go into it now. Next slide. Specifically, we've been quite active in the small island developing states. We're currently exploring whether to establish a specific Australasian Oceania chapter for INGSA to deal with the Pacific region. I'll come to the Caribbean region in a moment, and I'll come back to the Indian Ocean region later on. One of the early workshops we had was in Fiji at the request of the Pacific Commission, jointly with the University of the South Pacific, and to enhance the capacity of those working in the Pacific Commission to have greater impact on the policy community of the science that the Pacific Commission does in the areas of NCDs, in the areas of marine science, fish stock management, and so forth. And that has led to a discussion which is still incomplete about the need to develop a Pacific Science Academy, because the Pacific Island states are the one group of countries in the world for which there's no scientific academy to represent them, and that leaves them out on a limb. And I actually believe it's an urgent matter for the 24 small island states in the Pacific to have access to greater linkages to the scientific community. Next slide. Also in the Pacific, we ran in conjunction with UNESCO a major workshop for about 15 or 16 of the Pacific small island developing states to focus on the needs and building the gap, the linkages between the Pacific community and the Pacific policy community and the Pacific science community. The most interesting thing of that is 5 ministers of education from SIDS attended the 2-day meeting from Tonga, Fiji, Vanuatu, Nauru, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the 5th one, Samoa, of course. And they actually jointly produced a declaration at the end of that meeting, which highlighted that every country should have a person who is the contact point, the focal point between the science community and the policy community. In a country like New Zealand, that would be called a chief science advisor. And it's interesting that at the 2017 STI forum, that recommendation was made strongly by the floor, but was not communicated from the floor to the high-level political forum. And I think that remains a major concern to me, that there is a gap between attending the high-level, the TFM, and what's actually transmitted. The fact that very few countries have that focal point is actually a major concern for INGSA and for the ISC. Next slide. Perhaps one of the most interesting and successful workshops we've ever had was in Jamaica, where approximately 8 countries, most of them SIDS, including Jamaica, Barbados, Bahamas, sadly affected today, of course, Guyana, Trinidad, and St. Lucia attended. The interesting thing was the number of ministers who sat through that meeting, as well as government scientists and policymakers. There were 3 themes to that meeting. One was capacity building in the social sciences and relationship to public policy. And the theme that was focused on was crime and corruption, which of course in many small island states in the Caribbean, for example, is a limiting factor in making progress on the SDGs. Secondly, it was on the NCDs, and in particular on the issues of nutrition and obesity in the NCDs. And thirdly, it was on better coordination on disaster, the science of disasters than is presently there. And I think the interesting thing of that meeting is it subsequently led directly to the appointment of a science advisor to the Foreign Ministry of Jamaica, who has particular responsibilities in relationship to the SDGs, and lengthy discussions between myself and the Prime Minister of Jamaica on how they might establish a science advisory mechanism as a whole. And in fact, Jamaica has now become very active within the INGSA community and is playing a major role in one of the other things that INGSA looks after, which is the Commonwealth Science Advice Network, which itself brings the British Commonwealth countries together on these issues, of which SIDS make up about half the membership. Next slide. Finally, just to point out that we are now in the process of setting up a small island developing state liaison and advisory committee. We're currently in the process of consulting with small island developing states to set up a committee that will have direct input into the policy setting processes of the ISC. The reason we're doing that is because of the relatively small profile of the small island developing states through the current mainstream membership system. And so we're approaching the small island developing states to nominate perhaps 2 from the Pacific region, 2 from the Indian Ocean region, and 2 from the Caribbean region to form a committee which will be attended by myself and Flavia Schlegel, who's our UN ambassador, our ambassador for science ambassador for the ISC, and we will be asking a senior diplomat who you will know well, he hasn't been approached yet, to also join the committee from the small island developing state, so that we actually get closer liaison into the operation that Ambassador Young and her colleagues operate to bring in the policy setting of the SIDS community. We're trying very hard to make sure that in what we do, the small island developing states are listened to, are fully involved, and that we play our role in building the capacity of those countries to do more for themselves. Now, there are many issues because, of course, many of them have very small capacity because of their small populations, and working through how to do that in a way which is not patronizing is quite sensitive. The other point that I would make, last point I would make, is recently, on behalf of ISC, I chaired a meeting of the Global Forum of Funders for Sustainability, which are a number of the government agencies, major government agencies, such as the Canadians and Americans, along with various foundations in Washington, to talk about better coordination of funding of research for sustainability. And within that, what is clear to me, and I see it when I go to the Pacific, which is the region I understand best because I am from New Zealand, namely the duplication and lack of coordination and much of the science-related ODA that goes into the small island developing states. There is a need for far better partnership and coordination rather than having academics tripping over themselves from donor countries trying to assist in many of these island states. And so I think there's a lot to do, but it comes back to the fact that we need discussions like this to get a better understanding between all the partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Lucilla and Professor Gluckman for presentations about what the International Science Council is doing and how you bring science and scientists to the UN. We agree it's very important with the use of scientific evidence to inform policy at all levels. So we are very grateful for your support as well. We have reached the question and answer session. For participants, if you have any questions to the presenters, you could either raise your hand, write in the chat box, or just take the floor to ask questions. So I see Arthur. Please go ahead, Arthur.
Yes, this is Arthur Dahl. I've worked on science policy interface with SIDS for 50 years, starting with setting up the Caribou Key field station in Belize. And then I was the advisor to all the Pacific Island countries of the South Pacific Commission on Environment and its organized SPREP before I joined the UN System-Wide Earthwatch and coordinated science policy at the global level in the 1990s. So this is a subject obviously that interests me very deeply. Two particular questions. One is, with next year being the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, I think it's important to be planning now for how to strengthen the science policy interface at the UN itself, and particularly the voice that SIDS can have in that process, because often it's the big countries that speak at the UN, and SIDS need to have a voice there for science. And one related question, which I've seen a lot in recent years, and that is with the increasing privatization of scientific information, poor countries and poor scientists are both going to be cut off from access to the scientific literature and scientific knowledge. And it seems to me this is an area where SIDS and ISC raise their voice to make certain that access to science is not cut off by the high fees for access to journals and other information. Two issues I think would be worthwhile considering in this session. Thank you.
Peter here. Perhaps I can
Thank you very much.
The ISC would agree with you on both those points, Arthur, and in fact is taking the lead on, is trying to take the lead on both. In terms of the second point, we have a major theme in terms of open science, as does UNESCO, and we both, and everybody is working towards a practical open science policy and open publication policy to get there. There, as you'll be aware, issues of interest to be resolved, not the least being the financial state of scientific societies if they lose the income from journals. But I think there's rapid progress on that issue, and UNESCO, I think later this year, Lucilla may correct me, is going to release a policy in relationship to open science. And I think the scientific community is closely in agreement with it. It's the practicalities behind it. With regard to the first point, I think while it wasn't particularly successful, I think it was a very sad sign when the current Secretary General did not renew the mandate of the Secretary General Science Advisory Committee. That, I think, was a very bad signal indeed, and the ISC has tried to communicate to the UN the consequences of that and the bad signalling it's given. We have suggested other mechanisms that might be more effective than a scientific advisory board of the nature that the previous Secretary General had established. But I think not having any formal mechanism other than the major group mechanism, which is limited in what it can achieve, is a real problem. It is the reason why we appointed the first significant investment ISC made was to appoint Flavia Schlegel as effectively our ambassador to the UN system to try and make progress on this particular issue. I mean, because frankly, and I hate to say it given the comments that Ambassador Young made at the beginning, having been to a number of TFN meetings and been involved in the process, it's not an effective way of getting scientific voices into the decision-making processes. Obviously, many of the UN agencies have their own mechanisms, but when you're thinking about the issues at the global, at the more holistic level, there's a real defect.
Many thanks. Let's see if there are some other questions from the participants.
Lotta, can I jump in on the open science question? Would that be okay?
Please go ahead, Mario.
Yeah, just to highlight the importance of that, as Arthur Dahl mentioned. And I mostly follow the ocean processes at the UN, and there's been quite a lot of call in the negotiations for a new international treaty for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction for an open science mechanism. And perhaps facilitated through a clearinghouse. So every country can have access to data, to information, to networks of experts as well, to be able to participate in managing these areas. And I'm just wondering whether there might be some merit to thinking about some sort of open science mechanism that might be specific for SIDS. So I'll leave that as a question.
Many thanks. Let's see, we have one question in the chat box. I'll read it out. 2017 was the International Year of Sustainable Tourism for Development. Today it remains an important vehicle for economic development within SIDS. Where do you see any interface between scientific research and the tourism sector?
Well, I think there's quite an active, in some universities, there's quite an active community of the science of tourism from a number of points of view. For example, the environmental footprint of tourism, the balance between what you might call volume tourism and high-value tourism because of the impact in different ways on the environment. There are experts in that area. It's not an area which has got an international global community that's really built up, to my knowledge, into a critical mass or into a collegial mass. And maybe that's something that we should take back as a question into the ISC, because I think it's actually a growing issue. I mean, if you look at the carbon footprint of tourism, it's not trivial, for example. If you look at the impact on some fragile ecosystems, it's certainly it's certainly compromising. So there is an area there of science, but I would agree with the implied question in the thing that the scientific community is not, while there are people that work on it, I don't think they've really come together well.
Okay, let's see if Lucilla wants to add something.
Yes, I would like to second what Peter said, and also say that there are probably opportunities to get the scientific community onto this particular issue and on the legacy of that international year. I was mentioning before that we're in the preparatory phase of the United Nations Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And that decade as a particular framework which will reunite the social and the natural scientists around the ocean. The ocean will provide the common background, whether you study social science or natural sciences. So I think there could be, and it's a decade long, so 1 year is always very dense with many awareness-raising activities, but doesn't provide for more long-term. So I wonder whether we can identify synergy with that decade following on the legacy of the International Year of Sustainable Tourism for Development, and I'm sure the ISC could provide brokering for that particular issue, because it will really provide an opportunity to get social and natural scientists to work together on a concrete endeavor.
Could I come back?
Lucilla. So we have reached the end of the webinar because we only have 1 hour. We, of course, want to highlight to all the participants on the webinar that if you have specific partnerships already that are ongoing or new ones, you are welcome to register it at our platform for SIDS partnerships, where we already have a lot of them, but we wish to have, of course, as many as possible registered. And before closing the webinar, I just want to see if Ambassador Young is still with us, if you wish to say something to close the webinar.
Yes, thank you very much. Start my video. Anyway.
Yes, we can hear you.
Very much for the participation. I I just had a question for Professor Glockman. Do you know, Professor, why it is that the Science Advisory Committee mandate was not renewed?
I have views on it, and I think it relates to the way it was set up. I think by reporting to the Director General of UNESCO, well, by being managed by UNESCO rather than out of UN headquarters, I think it had a limited effectiveness. I also think that the way the composition was set up wasn't necessarily led to the most value. But I also think that at the end of the day, it wasn't funded. It had no funding. So it met once every 6 months with no secretariat, no infrastructure behind it. And of course, just getting people meeting for a few hours to be talking heads achieves nothing. And so my own view is a better way to do this would be to take, for instance, the major group leaders, ISC, the World Federation of Engineers, etc., and work with them to use their machinery into the UN system in a more structured way, but obviously bringing in other players as well, so that the machinery which exists to do deep reports, deep dives, could be linked better to the need of the policy community to get informed, balanced viewpoints involving multiple countries, but more importantly, multiple disciplines. As Lucilla pointed out, there's not an issue in public policy where science cannot help, but it needs the natural sciences and the social sciences to be hand in glove. And that requires organisations like the ISC, which have worked very hard to do that. And I think that I'm not touting the ISC should do it all on its own, but I think there are mechanisms that exist globally that could be better linked to the UN system and to make progress on a number of these issues without it being an expensive exercise.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to bring it up with the Secretary General when we have our CARICOM caucus meeting with him, which is an annual thing. So thanks for that. And also to Mr. Dahl, I want to thank you for the mentioning the Caribou Research Station in Belize. I haven't been there, but I've heard of it, and it's still going strong. And so thank you for doing that and for your presentation. I thought it, and what I have to say is there was so much information given by the speakers, by Mario, by Director Veras, by Ms. Spinney, by Professor Glockman, and by Mr. Dahl, that I have to review the webinar and make notes, because stuff is going on apparently. There is a lot of science being discussed and coming into policy making, and I've got to make notes and sort of break it down into, I like numerical things and make it down into numbers. Number one, number two, number three, what is going on. So thank you very much for this webinar, very informative, and thanks to DESA for facilitating it along with the Science Council. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for joining, and we wish you a good day or a good afternoon wherever you are in the world. We will make sure that the webinar comes on our website and keep you posted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Grazie. Merci.
Bye-bye.
Bye.